Before we get started, just a reminder that you can find all of my available rental properties on my website at marcguzman.com. If you own an investment property, click on the Owner Services section to see our complete list of services. This episode is brought to you by Beniked Commercial Real Estate. There's more to building wealth in real estate than simply buying and holding. You need to have an entry and exit strategy. You need to know when to invest, have a plan to maximize return during the holding period, and have an exit strategy to sell and exchange the property into a bigger investment. This takes a set of highly qualified professionals to guide you from buying your first investment property to eventually upgrading to the 100-unit complex, providing wealth for you and your family. Brian Beniked and David Peel have over 35 years of combined experience specializing in helping families build wealth through real estate. They assist you in putting your investment on autopilot and will guide you along each exchange. Visit them at www.bcre.co. Again, that's www.bcre.co to give your future a jumpstart. It's becoming all too normal in the Bay Area lately. You look up, and instead of bluer sky or fog, you see nothing but smoke. Governor Jerry Brown said the other day that massive wildfires and smoke-filled skies are becoming the new abnormal here in California. The environmental impacts of these wildfires runs deep, but they also could have a significant impact on housing here in the Bay Area. Today we welcome Colin Davies from Security Pacific Real Estate to talk about how Bay Area housing is impacted by all the smoke. We also do a quick recap of the midterm elections' impact on housing and look back 10 years ago at a time when the country was in the middle of a massive recession. Colin, thanks for coming back onto the podcast.
Thank you, Marc, for having me.
Yeah, now in our new studio because, and actually, Sam, if you can find out what episode that was when Colin was last on. It was our highest and best when we were over at my Security Pacific desk. Mm-hmm. You're from Security Pacific. We've been colleagues for many years, and I'm excited to have you back, so thank you.
Thank you for having me, Marc. I'm excited to be here.
So there's a few things I want to talk to you about. Number one, we've got the California wildfires going on again. In fact, now the one in Butte County is I think the biggest one in California history, covering 135,000 acres or something. There's a map that came out, and I think it was a Chronicle that said, here's the coverage area of the fire. If it was in the Bay Area, here's how it would look like. And essentially all of San Francisco, Daly City, South San Francisco, all the way to Oakland, to Albany, Berkeley, all that would be completely just gone.
Wow.
It's yeah, I mean, it's the biggest fire in California history. So want to talk to you to see from your business, your perspective, how is this going to affect real estate? Have you seen it affect your buyers or your sellers?
Sure. So I think the immediate experience would be, with fires happening and the smoke that's in the air. I mean, for us, if it's kind of, I feel like if it's out of sight, it's out of mind. And last year with the fires that were in Sonoma, and just the air just being full of smoke, can't breathe, and it's an immediate concern for everybody living in the Bay Area and further out. The biggest thing I noticed last year was when I was working on a transaction out in Pittsburgh and going to see clients, and I thought it was bad in Richmond, East Bay area, and going out there and just really heavy smoke. The kids were out of school, working with home inspectors, termite inspectors that were going to the home wearing masks and just really feeling it and be like, wow, this is a concern. As recent as last Sunday doing an open house in El Cerrito Hills, there were a total of 7 people that came to the open house. And, I believe that was a big part because there was smoke. This property is beautiful, has panoramic views of the Bay Bridge, Golden Gate Bridge, and you could not see anything. So, for prospective buyers to come up to that home and look out the window and see smoke, or even discouraged and not even coming to the open house in the first place, that's immediate effect on the housing market here. As you get closer to the fires, I believe I've been reading that Paradise has been completely
gone.
Wiped out. And I think the latest I saw was about 9,000 structures. Depending on how much that's residential, commercial, that's an immediate impact on those people living there and working there. And obviously, it's the where do they go, right? They're immediately homeless, and they go stay with parents. They go stay at hotels. They go stay at motels. What do they do? Last year, my current wife, she works at the Claremont Hotel in Berkeley, and I want to say within a day or two of those fires, there was just overflow of people checking into that hotel, and in shock that needed places to stay. I texted her earlier this morning to see if she noticed an impact from the fires now that are happening up in Butte County, and she hasn't. But what it really translates is people are immediately displaced from their homes. And
even worse when they can't even go to a local hotel because the local hotel is already burnt down.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So that's the immediate impact. Where do they go? And then longer term, do they turn to rent? Do they rebuild? Do they push to other areas? And is that going to affect? Obviously now there's a higher demand and there's a limited supply. What does that do to home prices and affordability? So yeah, I mean, I think there's immediate impacts the closer you are, but also impacts further out that reach all the way down to the Bay Area.
Yeah, and this is the second time that the Bay Area's been essentially covered in a blanket of smoke. And if this becomes a new norm, and so if this is the new norm, I mean, some buyers are going to take that into account, that maybe once a year or every other year, there's going to be some crazy huge wildfire that's going to cause a big giant blanket of smoke to sit here in the Bay Area until it eventually evaporates.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting. And kind of like I remember last year when it hit, we ended up getting the masks, and when we were wearing them, we're kind of like, this is kind of funny. Do we really need them? And then last weekend I was down in like the Albany El Cerrito area, around Sprouts, and just walking the streets and seeing everybody with a mask on, like, oh, it's all good, this is normal, like we've adjusted, like this is not a big deal, when in fact it's a huge deal. Like you can't breathe, you literally can't breathe. And I think that's a really good point, Mark, that it's like if this becomes normal in the Bay Area, like a week or two at a time, or in the October, November months where there's this blanket of smoke, that's really going to change people's mentality on the desirability to live here.
Yeah, and the air quality rating is now red, which is, I believe, between 150 and 200 particles. And the measurement that they calculate, it's the same air quality as Beijing, China.
Wow.
And Beijing, China, though, it's been like that for many years. And, I mean, if you grow up and live there, I mean, you end up with a lot of lung complications down the road, because what I was reading is the biggest scare is not so much that there's smoke out there, but there's a lot of very small particles that you cannot see that do not get burnt up in the fires, and they're just simply floating and sitting in the air. And when you take that in, some of these particles can go in between, it'll go into your lungs, and then through whatever the stuff that carries oxygen to the bloodstream in your lungs. Yeah. No, but the actual part inside your lungs, it'll actually slip through there and get into your bloodstream.
Wow.
And then once it's in your bloodstream, depending on what chemical it is, it can have effects on you. Or if it builds up over time, that's where you can have some serious side effects. That's the scary part. It's not so much the smoke itself. It's these tiny little particles that just sit because they were never fully burnt up and destroyed.
Wow. That's incredible. Toxins in your blood. It's an added benefit to buying in the Bay Area.
Yeah. You got to buy a 2-bedroom house, 800 square feet for $1 million plus take smell toxins, right?
Yeah, get in the closing some air filters and air masks as part of the transaction. Wow, that's incredible to hear and then see firsthand, and to know that there's particles in the air right now that people are walking around their neighborhoods, probably with not too much insider knowledge of what's going on. I'm sure as over time and people become more aware and gain knowledge of what's going on, then that's going to translate into concerns, and should determine people's decisions whether or not they actually do want to live here, whether renting or buying.
Yeah, and you mentioned the people walking around with masks on. Most of the people I see are wearing the wrong mask that won't do anything. You have to buy the certain special type of mask that will filter out these particles. Many of them are wearing like dentist masks.
That's funny. I mean, it's funny. I mean, it's not, but it's true. And to see that happening, and I mean, this is relatively new for us. I mean, we obviously got a shock last year, but now that it's happening again, and that's definitely something to keep in the mind going into the future. If this is going to become more of a common thing, and if it does, making adjustments on how you're going to protect yourself, what tools you're going to use to protect yourself from that, or ultimately change the psychology of if you want to live here or not.
Have you had any clients make comments about maybe changing their mind of buying and living in the Bay Area because of the wildfires?
I have not personally, but I think the comments really that I've heard is, most recently the open house on Sunday in El Cerrito, just with people not showing up. And I mean, a good part of that we're staying in our house. We're not going out in this. And if that's the case, I mean, sales will be affected by that, whether it's a few homes over that weekend or 2 weekends, where people don't want to go out and venture out, and they wait a month or so and then they're back in the market. So I mean, if they're taking off a cooling time while this passes, I mean, that directly affects the sale of a property, or at least the sale price of the property.
So what kind of adjustment do you think you would have to make if this becomes like a new norm? Dropping prices?
Because dropping prices are going into areas that have a little bit better air quality, or that aren't getting hit by the blanket of smoke, and working in those areas. I mean, I have noticed, kind of just diverting a little bit from the smoke, just with the changing market, that agents that want to continue to do as much business have gone into other areas and other counties to sell homes. And I mean, that's if that happens also with the smoke, that could be an option for agents to adjust, to get out and continue to sell property.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about the current market. Before we started to record, we were briefly just touching on it. You mentioned you started to see a change back in May. What was that change, and how has that developed in your own business and what you've seen in the market overall in the last few months?
Sure. I want to say in the beginning of the year, that first week of January to about that third week of January, there's just like a huge explosion of buyers that I felt that had entered the market and that were just pushing up prices, so quickly in that first month, with kind of really reflecting in closes in February. And
You're right. I was making offers on some properties in February that were getting 20 to 30 offers in February of 2018.
So for me, I felt like this explosion in the beginning of the year, and I feel like a lot of other agents throughout the Bay Area, and all price points were feeling that. And I went away in late April over to Europe for 3 weeks, and I started getting phone calls from people that wanted to sell their homes. And I was working on that, but when I got back about mid-May, on my whiteboard, I looked up. I was like, wow, I have so many sellers. And my first thought was like, oh, I'm such an awesome agent. I'm finally making that transition from buyer's agent to seller's agent. It's finally happened. This is awesome. And then with like a week processing it, I was like, you know what? I'm getting contacted by a lot more sellers that want to sell their homes, because they're realizing like, hey, we're getting really high prices. We're either going to cash out, move somewhere else, or cash out, buy something further north. And I was working on about 5 listings, and then I got, I think, about another 1 or 2 more, and less buyers. And I was like, you know what, this is weird. Like I believe there's just more sellers out there than there are buyers. And as we started to kind of get them onto market and then selling, I noticed that there would be less offers on the properties. And I remember right before August, I was like, man, I really got to get these sold, or I'm worried that they're not going to get anything. And I think the true kind of insight is I was working on a property in El Cerrito in a great neighborhood across the street from the old Castro junior high. And, I had like 70 people through the open house, and we ended up getting 0 offers with the due date. And I was like, wow, things have changed dramatically.
Wow. 70 people through the open house.
70 people through the open house. We were priced at $699. Comps had it about 800,000 plus. And I really had to reach out to agents that request disclosure packets and really try to hustle up business to get offers. And once we got into contract on that and we closed, I was like, okay, things have changed. I'm gonna have to reevaluate my whole strategy of due dates and list prices.
What did you close that one at?
We closed it at 827. But I feel like we just hit it. If we waited maybe a few more weeks, the sellers wouldn't have got what we got. And right around that time, at the end of August, going into September, you could just feel like buyers pulling back, and you could hear it at open houses too, where buyers would come in and say, "Hey, there's price reductions," and I feel that psychology too. Once that hits, you're not competing against like almost this auction atmosphere where there's a hysteria where you get so excited that you just want to get the house, and they overbid. And one thing taken from the home in El Cerrito is there's an agent who had a buyer that I met at the open house in El Cerrito, and she was communicating with me all verbally. And she'd call me up and say, "Oh, how many offers? What is it looking like?" And trying to get a feel, and then say like, "Hey, would we if we offered 850, would we?" And then you say, make an offer, do what you want to do, and if it's there and the seller wants it, we'll take a serious look at it and respond. And from 0 offers, she wanted it at 850, but when she found out 0 offers, she wants to bring it down. And then as we got offers, then she wanted to bring it up. So you have that psychology of like, you don't have a true value to yourself for the property, but you're basing your value on what other people want to pay for the property. Mm-hmm. And when that is happening, something's wrong with it. You're just bidding on hysteria. You're willing to pay on what the next person's willing to pay. And I think that's become eliminated from the market now, where people are really looking at like, okay, what can I afford? What does my mortgage payment look like? What is the home I want? What neighborhood it's in? Is it going to benefit my lifestyle? And ultimately, can we afford this? And is this the right decision? And I think a shift has taken place in the mentality of buyers. Now, like, let's get what we want as a priority and what we can afford. And now let's look in the neighborhoods. And if prices match up, then we're willing to buy. If they're not, we're not going to overpay for it or go in a bidding war. And if we can't afford it, then maybe we save more and explore other options, whether that's renting or considering other areas to live in.
Yeah, one thing I like to point out is, let's say you're looking at a specific neighborhood because that's really all you can afford. Once the market shifts, you're not just stuck on looking at that neighborhood anymore. You're now looking at other neighborhoods that you might also be able to afford because they dropped in value, right? Especially if you're, I guess a A-rated buyer, perfect credit, more than enough income, and you're not maxing out value, right? If you're maxing out value, if prices drop, well, then you're kind of stuck on that same neighborhood because that's all you could afford, right? Mm-hmm. But the more well-off you are, the more options become available to you, and then you see buyers really just picking and choosing what they want to look at, and I guess they're taking a lot more time to make offers. They're taking a lot more time to look at properties because there's that mentality of, well, if I'm seeing prices drop 5 or 8% in certain areas, what if I just wait a few more months? Mm-hmm. So one of the things I see as being a huge factor to this pullback is simply interest rates. Mm-hmm. We had interest rates at like 3.8, 3.9 that you could get early in 2018, 4%. Now they're at 5.1, I believe, was the last that I saw. They're expected to be 6.25 this time next year. I mean, how do you see Bay Area real estate being affected? I mean, when people started to notice a market shift. In July, Zillow said 14% of all listings had price reductions. August was 16%. September was 18%. So we're seeing more and more properties with price reductions. And with interest rates going up, I mean, is this just a market shift, like some people are saying, or are we seeing an actual market correction?
I think there's both going on. Going back to that kind of the before in the beginning of the year and actually over the last few years, just that hysteria of that auction atmosphere to a correction, which I think there's a number of factors that happened. One being that prices started to max out and everybody and their mom wanted to sell their house. And with that flood of inventory, all of a sudden now you don't have 5 offers, you have 1 offer. And 1 offer might be at that list price. So you saw a lot of the times where agents were listing low, say it was, the seller wanted 525 and, they listed at 450 thinking they're going to get above 525. All of a sudden there's not that hysteria. There's not that many buyers that are going to push that up and they offer $499. Funny thing is you're starting to see price changes. Instead of going down, you see that $475 going up to $525, which is more the transparent price of what should have been listed at in the first place. With
okay,
that,
so to explain that, what you just said, so you're seeing people getting away from the underpricing strategy and going to pricing it basically what they're looking for.
Yeah. I think that was one thing that started to happen as agents realized, the market was changing and the sellers were frustrated. But in regards to interest rates, absolutely. Like when you have, at 3.825 interest rate, and now it's pushed to, 5 1/8, I think even 5 1/4. All of a sudden that buyer cannot afford. I mean, I don't know what it would be on a $500,000 house, but that change in interest rates can make a huge difference on the amount they can pay a month and what they're going to be qualified for. And once interest rates start pushing up, houses have to adjust. There's no way around it. The house prices are going to have to adjust because the value is still in the house. But now that money that was before, a lot cheaper than it is now, you have money that you're borrowing at a higher interest rate, you can't qualify for that house. So that is going to push down prices. And as it gets up to a 6 1/4, I think that's Joel Singer said in the forecast for going into this year. I mean, with interest rates going up, I mean, that's pulling away money. That's taking away from the money supply from the economy. And people can't afford the houses. It's not gonna allow housing to continue to increase at the rate it did for the last 3-5 years, where interest rates have been pretty much nothing and free money for people to borrow and afford.
For a lot of the listeners and viewers that don't know who Joel Singer is, he's the CEO for the California Association of Realtors. Really smart guy. He was their chief economist up until I want to say 1998 when he took over as CEO. Super smart guy. I loved his. Were you at the big event?
Yes.
Yeah, that was a great presentation he gave. And I'm hoping 6.25 is. I mean, we're already at 5.1. I mean, 6.25 is. It seems like it could be right around the corner. So I'm hoping we end the year next year in 2019 at 6.25 and not somewhere closer to 7.
Wow, that'd be incredible. I mean, and taking too from kind of Joel Singer's forecast, and going into it, I think companies hadn't reported third quarter earnings yet. And I want to say over the last few weeks, companies have, and you get, record profits, corporations are doing awesome. But I think what might be missing is there were great times and it was booming. Like people were spending credit cards, they're going out to dinner, they're losing new cars, buying new cars. And all of a sudden you have a pullback that's happening in the most recent quarter. So it'd be interesting to see what fourth quarter profits are going to look like and get reported. I mean, just kind of looking in the news and seeing Starbucks, I think yesterday, they're cutting back 5% of like middle management, marketing jobs. You have Macy's that's pulling back on square footage of stores. So you see these corporations that are pulling back. And that won't be reflected until reporting after the fourth quarter. If that happens, then do the jobs, do they get pulled down? Once jobs get pulled down, then you have a whole nother wave going into the rental market and the housing market on buyers that can afford. So I think it's gonna be really interesting with interest rates pushing up. Profits getting reported for the fourth quarter, what that looks like. Are layoffs coming in? And if jobs are affected, that's going to be another thing that plays into, the housing market and the rental market.
There was a company, like a big company, and it might be a little wrong company, but it's a company in the size of like Adobe. They just announced they're going to lay off 18,000 people.
Wow.
And it may not be Adobe, but it may be it's a company that size, right? And so you said a few things here that I do want to touch on. Stock market, though. The stock market, there's been a lot of manipulation, and you see some great earnings, but one of the biggest reasons, and a lot of the companies on the stock market are overvalued, and they don't have the value, or they don't have the actual support for those values. And the biggest problem that we're seeing right now is that it's the highest ever stock buybacks. These stock buybacks, where the company buys their own stocks back, they can use it to manipulate their earnings, and that's what they're doing. And you see that because money's been so cheap for so long, it's very easy for them to do this. Now that money's starting to become a bit more expensive, there's many economists that think we're going to see a slowdown in stock buybacks. That could then and one thing that was also interesting that Joel Singer said at the big event is that this is the first time that the housing economy has decoupled from the overall economy. Usually economy goes up, housing goes up. Economy drops, housing drops. But the economy is still doing very strong. I mean, we're expected to finish the year like 3.5, maybe 4% GDP. Next year's predicted to be 3.5% GDP. That's a very strong economy. But then the housing market's already starting to slow down and starting to have its own effects. So now we're in an area of, well, we don't know what could potentially happen. And if the housing market's already in a small correction, and then maybe in another year or two, the economy overall starts to really slow down because now money's not as cheap, companies are not doing buybacks, people start to realize, wait a minute, these stocks are really overvalued. They start to pull back. Now we're getting into a bear market. Bear market kicks in after the housing market's already slowed down after a year or two. Now we could see a lot. I mean, for people out there looking to buy, if you wait a couple years, you may have a really good opportunity to snatch up. I mean, you'll have choices from so much inventory on the market. It's going to be more expensive, but the drop in prices are going to compensate for that.
Absolutely. I think that's exactly right. As money becomes more expensive, and yes, it's more expensive, but you have the opportunity, which Marc said, it will compensate for the prices. So I would see if that does continue, the interest rates continue to go up, the prices are going to have to adjust. That will basically compensate for the buyer to be able to afford it. And regarding the stock market, just having these companies so overvalued with doing stock buybacks, and just having these companies like SoftBank, seeing the amount of money that they're putting into tech companies. I mean, their vision fund, I think they pledged $100 billion. They have a huge stake in Uber. I think they just announced today they're committing another $3 billion to WeWork. So you have this money. I mean, a lot of is sourced from Saudi Arabia. That I think they contributed $45 billion to SoftBank's Vision Fund. But you have this huge amount of money getting dumped into tech companies. Compass was one of them that they allowed Compass just to explode and be able to buy. I think they bought Paragon and they bought Pacific Union. So you have this venture capitalist money coming in and funding a lot of companies that are not even profitable. I mean, Tesla was unprofitable for how many years? And I think just in this last quarter, they reported a profit, but what their stock's trading on by the amount they're earning. So you have this huge amount of capital just pumping into the stock market. And as companies go public and shareholders get rich and they're able to create jobs, you almost have this artificial amount of money, capital in the economy that I think pumps into the Bay Area housing market, from Sunnyvale all the way down to Oakland, San Francisco, and even further north. But when does that stop? When do these companies, stop funding money? I mean, SoftBank alone, I think, has way more debt than they actually have cash on hand. I think it's like 13 trillion yen they have in debt, and like 2 to 3 billion yen, or 2 to 3 trillion yen on cash. So when you have this huge amount of debt and that they're servicing the debt with money that they have that eventually they're not going to be able to afford, when does that money supply stop? So, I mean, who knows where the stock market will go, but there are signs with which I feel like I see and a lot of people see, that there's a bubble and that it's overinflated. But it kind of goes back to the same hysteria. Like, if you see the stock market go up, like, hey, why don't I buy? And it's going to continue to go up, and then I'll sell, right? But when does that correction happen? Does that happen next year? Does that happen the next few months? Or maybe, it continues on. But that should be a concern to, coupling the stock market with the housing market, and maybe looking at the indication as the first wave is the housing. We already feel it. We already see it. And is that going to entail into the stock market in the near future?
Mm-hmm. Now, a month ago, I was at the California Association of Realtors Expo down in Long Beach, and they had a great forum, a 2-hour forum there for global real estate. And they had a couple of speakers there, and it was really impressive. I love going to the Global Real Estate Forum because not many agents deal with real estate on a global level, but it gives you a lot more perspective onto what's going on at the local level, because there's a big percentage of buyers that are foreign buyers, and they buy for investment purposes or even immigration purposes. Well, how does immigration changes, whether it's from the new administration or from the prior administration, how do certain rules and regulations affect immigration that then affect how many foreigners want to buy real estate? And it was very interesting how they were breaking it down. They had an immigration attorney discussing how certain rules, and without getting too technical, but if someone wants to look it up, EB-5 immigration, how there's a lot of loopholes in EB-5 immigration, and how people are able to get visas and then come over here to the U.S. But prior to the Trump administration, and in fact the Obama administration neither administration had anything to do with these changes, but it was the actual immigration department that said, you know what, we need to start enforcing some rules and stop letting people use loopholes. So they didn't even make rule changes. They just decided, let's start enforcing it. Oh. That simple enforcement is now causing a slowdown in EB-5 immigration, which then causes a slowdown in real estate purchases. And you're starting to see a lot of foreign investors going away from single-family investment purchases and deciding, you know what if we buy commercial property, multifamily or office retail space? And so now you're starting to see a shift from foreign investors buying single-family homes to getting out of it. They make up 15, 20, 25% in some areas of purchases. So if you're talking about even a 50% drop in that, let's say they were 20%, but now they drop, you're looking at 10% of the buyers leaving the market. And many people, if you don't work with foreign investors, you don't even notice this, but you see the market effects of it.
Absolutely. Wow. Marc, are you seeing that in the commercial side and multi-unit business? Have you noticed a huge change in this area?
I've noticed more people wanting to get into multifamily investments. People are starting to realize that single-family homes, when you look at it from an investment point of view, you're making a negative return or you're breaking even. And sometimes it's not even calculating inflation into it. You calculate inflation, your single-family homes tend to be the worst investments when you're looking at it from an analytical point of view, because the return's not there. It's very hard to even keep up with inflation. That's why if you own several single-family investment properties, it's always best to sell those and trade up into a multifamily unit or multifamily building. And the problem with owning investment property with that are single-family homes is that you're at the mercy of the housing market, right? The majority of the buyers that are going to buy your investment property are going to be people that want to live in it. So one of the drawbacks is if you have a tenant in there, you have to evict a tenant, and then you end up with no rent, and then you have to sell the property. And if the housing market crashes or turns around, you're still not going to get the value that you really want. And so it's really risky if you really want to focus as an investor on single family homes. But that's where a lot of investors start, right? So I think if you're beginning to invest, single family homes tend to be the cheapest entry point. Not always, but they tend to be. The easiest way is if you're willing to live in a fourplex, because financing for 1 to 4 units is the same. If you can buy a house, don't buy a house. Buy yourself a duplex, triplex, fourplex, live in it for a year or two, right? Then convert your unit into a rental unit, move on and buy another place. Before you know it, after 10 years, you own like 3 or 4 or 5 of these places, and then you're able to sell 4 of them and exchange them up into a 20, 30 unit building, right? Wow. So there's different ways to do it, but you just have to put in the time, be willing to live inside these units if that's an option. And that's typically a good option if you're limited on cash, right? So then you can do FHA financing, 5%, 10% down on a fourplex, move into one of the units. And so you can get into units with limited funds that way. But so going back to single-family homes, we're noticing a lot of people wanting to get rid of their single-family homes and get into multifamily investment property. And really what it comes down to is if you have 4 units and one person leaves, no big deal. You still have 3 units covering expenses, sometimes even your profits, right? Single-family homes, someone leaves, well, you're still paying the mortgage, you're still paying taxes, you've got no money coming in, you're at the mercy of the housing market. Whereas multifamily buildings, investors are looking at, well, what does the income produce and what's going to be at the end of the day, my cash on cash return. And there tends to be, and there's up and down trends in the multifamily market too, but it's based on what does an investor want? Do they want a 5% return? Do they want a 6% return? Usually it's fluctuating 1 or 2%. It's not really fluctuating, like 4 or 5%, like how the housing market can, 5% drop, in a matter of a few months, right? So it's completely different. It's a lot more stable than the housing market as far as values overall, and it's more predictable. And in the Bay Area, with the housing in such high demand, it's pretty good investment because you buy something, you're almost guaranteed to be able to raise the rent for the next 4 or 5 years.
That's an interesting point. It kind of hits home a little bit. Just recently, I've been working on 2 fourplexes. One I'm helping a guy work with, Ken Rogai. Another one I'm co-listing with Kumi Ha in office. And
both good agents too.
Incredible agents. And to go from, never working with a duplex, maybe listing, 2 homes on one lot, but to now having 2 transactions that are multi-unit investment properties. And that was another thing, like, wow, this is interesting that I'm in kind of this realm, or this is a new gate that I'm walking through instead of single family homes, and hearing what you're saying, Marc, it makes
this is a whole nother world,
complete sense where there's value, because I guess investors are basing it on the income that's producing and what their return is going to be and what their cash on cash is going to be, and then looking at the investment through that way instead of the single family home that could fluctuate greatly depending on the home. But this is more a math problem where you look at the number and say, okay, this makes sense, there has value in the numbers, and this makes it a good investment. So.
Yeah, every now and then you have someone that wants to buy a building for pride, right? Maybe something sitting across from City Hall, something 1 block away from BART. Sometimes you run into investors that for whatever reason they're willing to pay a little bit more than what the numbers really tell you to pay. But that's their thing. But for the most part, investors are going to be looking at the numbers, running the numbers, and seeing, is this a good investment for me or not? And then that's, well, I should say that's what all investors should be doing. There are some investors that, unfortunately they don't know, especially if they're brand new investors. One of the biggest problems is they don't know how to properly run the numbers. So they buy it with the same mentality as the housing market, right? They're saying, well, if this fourplex sold for $800,000, if this one's for $750, that's a steal. I'm going to buy it for $750. But when you run the numbers, well, wait a minute. The $800,000 one is at market rents. The $750 is at half the rents, but you're in a rent control city. You're not going to be able to get the rents up to $800. So what you end up having is a negative return. Wow. And so, in fact, I've got a case like that going on with a new client. But yeah, it's really important, like for new investors, or if you're an agent just getting into that world, you definitely want to properly service your clients, both the seller side and the buyer side. You need to understand how to analytically go through the property and figure out all the different key metrics of investment. That way you can advise your client and say, hey, look, this is what the property produces. Here's what I think the property can sell for based on the going cap rates, based on what it generates. What do you want to do? Now it's their decision, but at least they know. And for a lot of the new investors, they just don't know that. And one of the problems I've seen, I've made a few videos about this recently on Instagram, is that sellers leave so much money on the table when they're selling investment property, because they may own 4, 5, 6, 7 units, right? But they're not going through their rents and analyzing it as if they would on the buying end. So what happens is, especially in the areas of no rent control, they're not raising the rents every year. They're not doing anything to the point where they're selling the property for potentially $200,000, $300,000, or $400,000 less than what they could get. Now that's great for a buyer, because the buyers are going to run the numbers and say, yeah, this is a steal, because in 3 years I can raise it $400,000 in equity, maybe even a year and a half. That's a steal. I'm going to do it, right? So yeah, you're willing to buy the price or buy the property, but you're buying the property based on the going cap rates for that area. So you're buying a property with the potential to increase the equity of hundreds of thousands of dollars in the next few years. But I mean, if you're advising a seller, you need to help them to capture that on the sell side, right? Maybe not all of it, but if you can help them get an extra $200,000, why not?
Absolutely.
That's where your value as an agent comes into play.
Absolutely. And that would lead into that you need a great property manager to manage that property and get those rents up to where they need to be.
Well, that's one thing that we do on our properties here, is that we do an analysis on every property. And there's some owners that say, hey, there's owners that have owned properties for 30 years. They can't even take depreciation on it anymore. And it just makes sense to sell it and move on and upgrade to something. Or even if they don't upgrade, buy another property. You can then take depreciation on it, right? But they simply don't. For whatever reason, there are some people who are sentimental. They inherited the property. It was their parents' property, whatever the case is. They want to hold on to it, and that's fine. But we will do a full analysis on every property and present it to them and say, hey, look, here's what we can do for you if you're interested. And so yeah, I mean, if you have an investment property, you need a property manager that understands that, and that's one of the things I've seen, is that many property managers, they may be good at managing the property, but that's just managing. It's not asset management.
Sure. And that's a huge benefit if you have that in your corner, and you can know what the rents are, know how to increase them to get the full potential. I mean, like you said, you get another 100, 200, 300,000 in equity on the sales part, or if they don't sell, you push it up to where the rent should be, so you're maximizing your investment.
Yeah. Now, with the midterms now over, what's your opinion on the overall midterms for housing?
So I think the big two is Prop 10 and Prop 5. with Prop 5 not passing, I know that's going to affect directly, my parents, and many other people that are. It's over 55, right? If you're over
Correct.
55, so I believe what Prop 5 was trying to do was going to allow people over 55 to sell their property and transfer their tax basis into another property. And I believe there's a few still, like Prop 60, Prop 90, that allow you to transfer in county for the ones that participate.
In county is Prop 60. Prop 90 is county to county.
Okay.
But the problem with Prop 90 is that it's voluntary. So only 11 out of 52 or 53 counties in California allow it.
Wow. So with Prop 5 not passing, my mom lives in Kensington, so she's in Contra Costa. Say she wanted to buy something in Albany to downsize, she would have been able to transfer her tax basis to maybe a smaller property in Albany and buy a 2-bedroom, 1-bath, and keep that tax basis. Actually, I believe lower it if it's less than what she sells it for. And then they compensate on the purchase price of the replacement property. But so that's a direct impact to family around me, but then also for the housing market in general. Those people that are 55 or 60 or 65, and they don't have their knees like they used to, where they can go upstairs, and it's becoming more difficult to live in their home, and they're looking for something smaller or something that's on a single level. And what it would allow them to do is sell the home and then move into something smaller, keep the tax basis, and keep it moving. But with that not happening now, I mean directly, I think it's gonna be harder for people in my family to sell that are over 55. If that's something we wanted to do, but blanket across the whole, in California, people over 55, that they're gonna have a lot less options. If they are looking to move a smaller house, great, they can sell their home and be able to purchase it, but their property taxes are just gonna skyrocket, and I think that's gonna limit the amount of sales and purchases for them to find a replacement property, which is kind of sad. And I think the biggest people that were opposed to it were the unions and the school, saying that it was going to take away that property taxes. But what I think is kind of funny is when they sell that house to, if it's somebody under 55 or a first time home buyer, that factors right into their property taxes, and the county still gets it. So
their opposition, per my understanding, came because of the LAO, the Legislative Analyst Office. So whenever there's a prop, a bill, or whatever proposed, the LAO will actually prepare. It's supposed to be a neutral study, and they prepare the cost benefits or the negatives of passing that bill, right? And so the LAO came out and they said that the first year would experience a drop in tax revenue. Then after that, they said it's really hard to tell. They said it could be continue on the negative side, or it could be break even. Now, California Association of Realtors did their own study, and they're like, well, no, this is going to be basically a break even wash point, because, like, let's say in your, you said it's your mother's, right? Mm-hmm. In your mother's case, if she sells the property in El Cerrito and goes, or Kensington, and goes to Albany, whoever's buying that Kensington property, their tax basis would jump up, because most likely it's not going to be someone else transferring their tax basis there. It's going to be a brand new buyer. The tax basis for that property goes up, mm-hmm. and now Contra Costa makes up. Now, yeah, Alameda tax revenue drops slightly, but it ends up being a wash because mm-hmm. people are moving across the state of California.
Absolutely. So I think that was kind of the biggest, impact that I think will affect the housing market directly. With Republicans and Democrats, and what the Republicans got control of the Senate and Democrats got the House. I think the next day the stock market rallied, but I think the two biggest one was Prop 5 and Prop 10.
And just to finish up on Prop 5, and the biggest reason why CAR was pushing it is that it would release more inventory on the market. Mm-hmm. The problem why the affordability is so low right now is because there's not enough inventory on the market, not enough supply, but there's a huge demand. So the only way to drop prices is to put more inventory. But it's not that they wanted to drop prices dramatically, we have so much demand coming into California, we can't keep up. But it would allow some more people to have that opportunity, especially for people over 55 to transfer it wherever they want to be. It would just free up a bit more inventory. They were talking about 45,000 more transactions per year that they would allow that are not going to happen, because the biggest problem is we're seeing people over 55 years old, they're selling their home an average of 27 and a half years. Wow. When I got into the business in 2003, the average person sold every 4 to 6 years.
Wow.
4 to 6 years. Wow. Now it's 14 and a half years. Wow. People over 55, 27 and a half years.
That's incredible. I mean, that's a testament too to pricing. Like, if you're not going to move, you can't afford it.
Yeah, people can't afford to move, so they stay in their homes. Yeah.
Yeah. You have them doing home improvements and all the remodeling kitchens and everything. But yeah, that was interesting to see Prop 5 not passing.
Yeah. Now, I'm excited to see, now that Gavin Newsom is going to be our new governor here, how his promise of 500,000 brand new construction units per year is going to turn out. That, I think, is extremely aggressive, but Cox wanted to build 300,000. Again, still a little bit more realistic, I guess, but still overly optimistic, because right now we're only building about 80,000 units per year, but we require at least 180,000 to keep up with demand, and we're short by 2.1 million housing units right now. Wow. So we'll see if he can really do it. I mean, do you think he can do it?
You know, it might be an ambitious goal. I think maybe the biggest challenges are going to just be with the cities and counties that kind of put red tape and make it difficult to build. I mean, hearing about the projects in Richmond and just seeing how long projects take to build, or in Berkeley, just how slow some of the buildings have come along, or even in Oakland, where you have people literally setting fires to the buildings. It's going to be just interesting. I guess, you can get the city and county and councils on board to really kind of just streamline the process and make it a proactive to building housing, and not, putting constraints on the timeline, because if it is, every year getting worse and worse and not building enough units, if it's only 80,000 now and, we're short 2.1 million, and, that's going to be a hard battle to win, unless you have councils and the city and county say, hey, let's make this happen. Let's get proactive and let's get it going.
Yeah, Brian, my business partner here, does development also, and that development construction world is a whole different animal in itself, right? And you hear of projects, like new development projects, like the one closest to us is Hilltop. I mean, literally 1 block away from Security Pacific. They're talking about building 3,000 to 5,000 residential units there, and they've started to remodel the Hilltop Mall, but what they're really doing is they're getting projects entitled, and their goal is to sell these entitlement projects of 300 to 500 units to actual developers who will come in and build. So because they're announcing these projects, and because they've got these fancy images and ideas, that's not necessarily what's going to happen. It's going to depend on the demand of developers coming in, buying those projects, and then developing the projects themselves. So it's very interesting, because you can say, yeah, we'll get 500,000 units approved. Great. Who's going to build it? Right? So it's two different things. And so now I believe both of the candidates running for governor were talking about actually building, not entitling projects, but going through the construction phase. I mean, you have neighborhoods that oppose, right? Not in my backyard, the NIMBYs, right? Then you have cities that purposely try to oppose developments for one reason or another. But one thing to help that is a recent law that went into effect this year, where if a developer wants to build a project and the project 100% fits within the city guidelines, the city cannot deny them. Otherwise, the city faces like $100,000 fine and some crazy violations. And I believe there's a lawsuit in Cupertino going on right now. That was the first one to sue the city government under that new law. But then there's also CEQA, and CEQA's another problem where someone can sue a developer anonymously. They're never identified, and they can hold up the entire project until it goes through court. And what do you do as a developer if you're trying to build units, and we all need housing units, but then someone anonymously sues you, you don't know who it is, and you have to defend yourself.
That's crazy.
It creates a lot of issues. And so I'm really curious to see how Newsom really addresses all these different factors, because I think CEQA and NIMBY are really the two biggest issues now that we have that law where cities can get in trouble.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that all makes sense, and just having a proactive government that supports building and developing if that's what they want, and making it easier.
So for the listeners, we referenced you were on the podcast. Actually, you were on the podcast almost a year ago, November 29th. November 29th.
Annual.
Yeah. It was Real Realtors 13 when it was called Real Realtors. Now it's called Highest and Best. So, we talked about the transition from the restaurant to real estate and 1031 exchanges. And for the listeners, go back and listen to that episode. It was very interesting to hear your experience in going from bartending and restaurant industry to real estate, and how there's a lot of similarities right there in customer service. So it was a great episode. We've got Thanksgiving coming up next week. What's your favorite tradition for Thanksgiving?
So this goes way back to when I was a kid. My grandma always used to make really delicious pumpkin pie. As we got older, to do it quicker, she didn't put the crust on. But there's reasons for that. But what I used to like to do with my brother and my sister is when we get the pumpkin pie, you cut off the tip of it and you put it to the side, and then you're quiet while you eat. You don't say anything while you eat the rest of the pie, and then you save that little tip piece for the last, and you eat it, and you make a wish, give your thanks for everything, and put that out in the universe. So that was a Thanksgiving tradition that I still find myself doing, even not on Thanksgiving when it's a piece of pumpkin pie. Cut off the tip, put the tip to the side, enjoy the pie, and then give thanks and blessings and make a wish.
That's awesome. I've never heard that one before. That's very cool, though.
Yeah, I don't know where it started, but yeah, it's
usually when you ask people that question, it's like, oh yeah, I eat apple pie. Yeah, yeah. So does everyone else, right? Yeah, no, that's great. That's great. So, hope you have a great Thanksgiving. Thanks for being on the podcast again.
Absolutely.
For the people that want to contact you, do business with you, you do real estate in Contra Costa, I assume also Alameda, Solano County, the Bay Area. What's the best way for people to contact you?
You can always reach me on my cell phone. It's 510-435-3624, and then of course the social media. You can find me. It's just Colin Davies. You'll see me on Facebook or Instagram. Send a message or anything to see what I do, and then of course email as well. But you can find that on my social media accounts, and I look forward to helping anybody out there that's interested in real estate.
Awesome. Well, thank you.
Thank you, Marc. Thank you, Marc.
Thank you so much for listening to the podcast. Thank you to our producer, Sam Lubman. Please subscribe, like, comment, and share the podcast. Remember, you can listen to the podcast on iTunes, Podbean, iHeartRadio, Google Play, SoundCloud, and anywhere else you listen to podcasts. For more information on my business as a property manager and real estate team, go visit my website at marcguzman.com. I really want to thank all of you for listening. It means the world to me, and I hope today's episode provides you value in your day-to-day life. I created this podcast to help showcase the many great people that live in this world and help share some knowledge that I've learned along the way in life. Again, thank you for listening. Check out our sponsors, and I'll catch you on the next episode.